Today is 28th September, so now we are in the last days in September. And of course, as September ends, October comes, and October is the traditional month in this part of the world for the start of the heavy autumn rains and for the mud season, the Rasputitsa, to begin, which many, such as, for example, US General Mark Milley, now retired from his former post as chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, well, they've told us that during the period of the mud season, offensive operations becomes extremely difficult. And that indeed does seem to be the general story and pattern of previous wars, and by the way, of this war also. And for the record, I understand that the weather conditions have been getting more difficult along the southern battlefields for some time already. Apparently there's been more rain and the ground is already starting to become softer. And though the foliage is still there, of course, that too will start to thin as autumn and winter start to approach. And of course, with thinner foliage, there is less cover for attacking troops trying to advance towards the enemy's trenches and fortifications. Though it's fair to point out that the Russians have taken advantage of the foliage, the cover of the foliage as well. So anyway, in summary, we are in the last weeks now before the autumn season begins, the Rasputitsa season begins, and it's generally acknowledged, despite brave comments from some Ukrainian officials like General Tarnavsky, that during the period of the Rasputitsa, offensive operations in Ukraine will come essentially to a stop. So, given that that is so, we are, one might think, in the last weeks of Ukraine's offensive, at least before the Rasputitsa starts. Well, as it happens, I've been keeping an eye on the Russian Defense Ministry's bulletins about the state of the war. Now, I've said on several occasions that one doesn't have to accept the absolute accuracy of all that the Russian Defense Ministry is saying in these daily intelligence briefings or bulletins or communiques, call them whatever you wish. But they do, I think, provide us with some general sense of the state of the overall fighting. And I noticed, for example, that the latest bulletins, the ones that have been published by the Russian Defense Ministry over the last couple of days, all appear to show a steep decline in the level of Ukrainian casualties. And just to give one example, this is what the very latest bulletin, the one that discusses the fighting on the 27th of September, says about the situation in the Zaporozhye region, specifically in the area of Verbovoye and Rabotino, though perhaps also including the fighting in the Vremivka salient as well. And it says this, in the Zaporozhye direction, units of the Russian grouping of troops, aviation, artillery, and heavy flamethrower systems, these are of course the deadly TOS-1A thermobaric multiple rocket launch systems, which are a devastating weapon in this war. Anyway, these units of the Russian groupings have repelled one attack by the 71st Jaeger Brigade of the Ukrainian military close to Verbovoye. In addition, the 47th, 117th mechanized brigades of the Ukrainian military, bringing together clusters of manpower have been hit close to Rabotino. Over 60 personnel, Ukrainian personnel, 2 armored fighting vehicles and 3 motor vehicles have been eliminated. That's 60 men. That, of course, includes dead and wounded, as I've said many times. But the point is, it's 60. At other times in this offensive, in fact, regularly during this offensive, the numbers have been much greater. They've been in the hundreds, but now they're in the tens. As we see, attacks do continue to take place, but they seem to be on a significantly smaller scale. And notice that in this particular case, over this course of this particular day, which is the 27th of September, the attack appears to have been conducted principally by one brigade, the 71st Jaeger Brigade, which has been trying to capture Verbovoye for many weeks now. It's the last fresh brigade drawn from Ukraine's strategic reserve to have been deployed to the battlefields. It's been fighting very hard to capture Verbovoye. Doesn't appear to have had much success, but anyway, it's made those attempts, and it doesn't seem to have been a particularly strong attack, because the Russians say that the attack was unsuccessful, and that seems to be confirmed by pretty much all of the reports I'm seeing from the battlefronts. But it doesn't appear to have been particularly large or sustained either. According to the Russian Defense Ministry, and let me repeat again, you don't need to accept these figures as precisely true. Only 60 Ukrainian personnel have been eliminated. I mean, that, of course, objectively is a lot of people, but not over the course of this offensive or in this war. And Ukrainian losses were 2 armored fighting vehicles and 3 motor vehicles. Notice that no tanks have been used in this area for some time, at least in attacks against Verbovoye. And the Russian Defense Ministry actually provides a list of other equipment that have been lost by Ukraine in this area of the battlefronts. Again, I'm talking about the Rabotino-Verbovoye sector. And once again, overwhelmingly, it is artillery. 2 US-manufactured M777 artillery systems, 1 Akatsiya self-propelled artillery system, as well as 1 Star B howitzer were destroyed. The fighting in the Verbovoye-Rabotino area, for the time being, seems to have reduced to small infantry attacks by groups of Ukrainian infantry, probing, trying to find places that they can break through, perhaps hoping that Russian defenses have weakened, and continuous artillery duels in which both sides focus on destroying the other side's artillery, but in which the Russians are detailing every day heavy Ukrainian losses. They claimed that they've just yesterday destroyed 2 more M777 howitzers and 2 Soviet-era self-propelled guns. So that's the nature of the fighting in the Rabotino-Verbovoye sector. I would say that reports are still speaking of more Russian advances in the area of the Vremivka salient. The Ukrainians seem to have given up all attempts to conduct offensive operations in the Vremivka salient. It's been a quiet part of the battlefield for some time. The only advances that are taking place in this part of the battlefield, in this part of the conflict zone, the only advances that are taking place in the Vremivka salient area are being carried out by the Russians. They're not, as I said, huge or very rapid advances, but they are nonetheless advances, and their primary purpose, as I've discussed previously, is to regain lost positions and to strengthen the defences in case the Ukrainians at some point decide to attack in this area again. Now, the heaviest fighting continues to be around Bakhmut and in Donetsk region, but most specifically around Bakhmut. And there's been quite a lot of news here, but this is what the Russian Ministry of Defense said took place yesterday. In the South Donetsk direction, the South Group of Forces repelled 10 assaults of the Ukrainian military's 54th, 93rd, 93rd Mechanized, 59th Mechanized, 79th Air Assault, and 5th Assault Brigade assault groups near Spornoye. That's not actually especially close to Bakhmut, but anyway, Klishayevka and Nevelskoye. Enemy losses were up to 390 men killed and wounded. Notice that here the Russian Defense Ministry makes it clear that they were killed and wounded. 4 tanks, 9 infantry fighting vehicles, 7 motor vehicles, and 2 US manufactured M777 howitzers. 1 ammunition depot of the Ukrainian 31st Mechanized Brigade has been destroyed near Zaria. So, whereas the Russians say that on the southern front lines in the key Rabotino-Verbovoye area, the Russians yesterday claimed that they eliminated 60 Ukrainian troops. In the Bakhmut area and in other places in southern Donetsk region, they claimed that they eliminated 390 troops, Ukrainian troops, and also, by the way, 4 tanks. Now, again, we don't need to take these figures absolutely at face value. We don't need to accept the total accuracy of these figures, but they do suggest that the most intense fighting, by far now, is taking place around Bakhmut, and that it is around Bakhmut that the last flicker of Ukraine's counteroffensive before the Rasputitsa closes in continues to take place. Now, on the subject of what is actually going on in and around Bakhmut, there's been many more reports this morning. The Ukrainians, over the last day or so, apparently trying to push the Russian defenses further towards the east. There's still fighting going on in Andreevka and Klishayevka. The Russian lines here are based around a railway line, which is presumably uses on elevated ground. The Ukrainians did apparently at one point succeed in pushing beyond the railway line, but they were pushed back, and there are some reports that in the area south of Bakhmut, the town the Russians call Artyomovsk, the Russians not only pushed the Ukrainians back, but they were able to push them back some distance and were able to regain some lost ground and, as the Russians like to say, improve their overall position in the Klishayevka, Andreevka, Kordyumovka area. Well, that's what the Russians say. There's also been a lot of Russian reports about the fighting in Orekhovo-Vasilyevka. This is this village to the north, some distance to the north of Bakhmut, but it was a village which the Wagner organization, in its offensive in the winter and spring reached, but never tried to capture. Anyway, the fighting has been apparently very intense for this village over the last couple of days. There has been at least 2 reports from Russian sources over the last couple of days claiming that Orekhovo-Vasilievka had actually been captured by the Russian army. This morning, there's been a further report claiming that the Russians have not only captured Orekhovo-Vasilievka, but that they finally consolidated control of this village. Well, that would be an important advance if it really is the case. I will wait to see whether the Russian Defense Ministry confirms it. But if it has happened, then it would suggest that things are not going well for Ukraine in the Bakhmut area either. And I would say that the claim that I saw did come from one of the most reliable of Russian sources. So it might this time be true, but we'll just have to wait and see. It is, however, also it seems to me, indisputable that it is indeed the Russians who are overall taking the initiative in the Orekhovo-Vasilievka area to the north of Bakhmut. So even if they haven't actually fully captured this village or captured this village, the fact is that it is they who hold the initiative here. And there have also been lots more Russian reports over the last few days, but also a particularly confident-looking report yesterday that the long, grueling fight for Marinka, this small town near Donetsk, which the Ukrainians had heavily fortified and which they defended intensively. Some Russian sources claim that it had been captured back in October last year. The fighting has ground on there, in fact, for a whole year since then. But there are some reports that the Russians are, in fact, now much closer to ending this battle, that there are only very few Ukrainian positions left, and that they're in the process of clearing these. And, of course, again, we will wait and see what the Russian Ministry of Defense has to say, and whether they finally confirm the capture of this obliterated, completely demolished, completely destroyed town. I will say this: if Marinka is indeed captured by the Russians, then multiple reports that I've been reading over the last few months all say the same thing, that the Ukrainian military positions in Vuhledar and Marinka are mutually dependent on each other. If the Russians capture Marinka, then the position of Ukrainian troops trying to defend Vuhledar, also, by the way, recently the target of heavy bombing by the Russian Air Force, well, in that case, the positions of the Ukrainians in Vuhledar will begin to become much more precarious than it has been up to this point. Now, I'm going to say something. There's been much discussion about Russian failures over the course of this conflict. When people talk about Russian failures, they tend to talk about the Ukrainian offensives in Kharkiv region and in Kherson region. I have consistently discounted the severity of Russian failures in Kharkiv and Kherson region. It seems to me that in Kherson region, the Russians made a decision to carry out an entirely rational and proper withdrawal, which resulted in the consolidation of their forces and a stronger defense ahead of Ukraine's offensive. And in terms of the fighting in Kharkiv region, well, that was a hideous embarrassment and in some ways severely mismanaged. But Russian losses there were relatively light, whereas Ukrainian losses were extremely heavy. So it's far from clear to me that even the offensive last year in Kharkiv region was a significant success in the end for Ukraine. By contrast, I think that the grinding battles for Vuhledar and Marinka have been deeply embarrassing for the Russians. I think that they made repeated attempts to capture Vuhledar, and all of their attacks in the area miscarried. There's been criticism of some of the command decisions that were made. The Battle of Marinka has continued, persisted for a whole year after some claims by Russian Russian sources that this particular town had already been captured. If Marinka is indeed captured, and if Vuhledar follows, well, that will be for many Russian commanders a massive relief, and finally the resolution of what has been a most embarrassing battle. Anyway, just saying. So that's the overall state of the situation on the battlefronts. There's been less news about Ukrainian missile attacks on Russian positions. I don't quite know why that is, whether the Ukrainians have run out of missiles or whether the Russians have blown up their missiles in their own assaults, or whether the Ukrainians are trying to recalibrate their attack programs, or what the reason might be. But there's been a lot less of this over the last couple of days. The Ukrainian drone attacks on Russia do still continue. There was 2 more reported over the course of today, for example, but Russian air defenses appear to be increasingly successful in bringing down these drones. And to the extent that the air war continues, it is overwhelmingly now conducted by the Russians against the Ukrainians, not the other way around. So, reasonably quiet period on the front lines. More Russian claims of more Ukrainian positions being captured in the Kupiansk, Oskol sector. There's some suggestions that if Orekhovo-Vasilievka has indeed been captured near Bakhmut, that could somehow affect the fighting in that part of the theatre, the war. I don't quite understand the geography of that, but never mind. But anyway, for the moment at least, if there is a Russian offensive still taking place towards Kupiansk, it's been conducted in a very incremental and careful way. Most probably, I suspect, preparing the situation for whatever big offensive the Russians are planning and which is to come. And about more of that shortly. But anyway, that is the overall situation on the front lines. So it could be the case, it may very well be the case, that the Ukrainian offensive has to all intents and purposes now ended. The relative quiet of the last few days might suggest that it's ended with a last big flicker of activity taking place in that area of Ukraine's apparently constant obsession, which is Bakhmut. That's where the biggest, most intense fighting is still taking place, but everywhere else things are now relatively quiet. Well, that's one view. I would say that we have had warnings now from a succession of Russian officials that there is or continues to be a Ukrainian build-up north of Verbovoye and Rabotino. Yevgeny Belitsky, who is now the as far as the Russians are concerned, the elected, legal, permanent governor of the Russian-controlled area of Zaporozhye region has said this. So has Vladimir Rogov, who is a well-known official and personality also from Zaporozhye region. The latest person to say this now is Denis Pushilin, who is also now the duly elected permanent governor of the Russian-controlled part of Donetsk region, the Donetsk People's Republic. And this is what TASS reports Pushilin has as saying. The Artyomovsk direction, that means Bakhmut, we register the enemy's attempts to push our forces along the Andreevka, Kurdyumovka, Klashevka line. This is primarily the enemy is primarily interested in the railroad. The enemy has achieved no positive results, was partially eliminated, and were partially pushed back to its initial positions. Meanwhile, Russian forces advanced their positions on Artyomov's northern flank near the settlement of Orekhovo-Vasilyevka. But then Pushilin goes on to say that he's heard that there is a major build-up of Ukrainian forces in the Rabotino-Verbovoy area near Orekhov, that there's a possibility that the Ukrainians might launch some kind of offensive, a renewed offensive, presumably before the autumn. But he seems confident. He says that the Russian military are aware of this build-up and they're making the necessary preparations to counter it. So anyway, we will see. That if that does happen, as I said, if there is such a big attack in this particular area, the Rabotino-Verbovoye area, in my opinion, it will be the last attack Ukraine will be able to launch before the Rasputitsa closes in. And I've already made known my own strong disbelief that Ukraine has the means any longer to sustain the offensive after the Rasputitsa ends. All this talk about Ukraine renewing the offensive in the late autumn and winter, that seems to me to be most unlikely. Anyway, that's the situation on the battlefronts. You might almost say all quiet on the Eastern Front, the Ukrainian battlefronts, except, of course, that people continue to die every day. And, of course, in the Bakhmut area, heavy fighting continues, though even there it appears to be going increasingly against Ukraine. But that seems to be the overall picture. It could be, as I said, that the offensive has effectively ended, except in Bakhmut, or it could be that the Ukrainians are going to try one last big throw. We will have to wait and see. Now, all of this as talk of a big Russian offensive continues. And there was one very interesting piece of information that came out yesterday. It was discussed in the Russian media. Redovka, this Russian newspaper, website perhaps more, the newspaper, or let's put it like this, internet newspaper. Anyway, Redovka discussed it at length yesterday, and this is a report that the Russians are in the process of reviving a concept that they'd put together, that they'd come up with during the Second World War. This is of creating so-called assault brigades. These are elite units which have the task of breaking through fortified positions, of breaking through fortifications. And the Red Army developed such assault brigades during the Second World War, and they played a leading role, a key role, in the Red Army's offensives after 1943, in enabling the Red Army to break through German defense lines. And it seems that the Russian military is in the process of creating such brigades all over again. These will bring together experienced and highly trained soldiers. So there'll be elite units, and their equipment will be structured around the objective of breaking through fortifications. Now, I suspect that they will be quite different in their structure from the kind of units that the West created in advance of the offensive, the Ukrainian offensive that we might be seeing the tail end of. The most heavy brigade trained and equipped by the West was the 47th Mechanized Brigade. This was equipped with the Leopard 2 tanks and the Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. And of course it was given a significant amount of mine clearance equipment that, as it turned out, nowhere near enough. But essentially, it was an armoured brigade. I mean, it was a heavy armoured brigade, and the Western idea, which, by the way, I still find baffling, I mean, I have never really fully understood it, is that these heavy tanks and infantry fighting vehicles would somehow roll across the battlefield towards the heavy Russian defences and somehow punch through and break through. And of course what actually happened, as we all remember, is that those tanks and infantry fighting vehicles burnt on the steppe. They were caught in the open by the Russian artillery, by the Russian helicopter gunships, and they also struggled, and many of them were destroyed in the Russian minefields. The assault brigades that the Russians are going to be creating will be very different. They will not be equipped in that kind of way. They will use much more engineering equipment than the 47th Mechanized Brigade had. They will basically be heavy infantry troops. They will be heavily equipped, much more heavily equipped, with powerful artillery guns, probably these very powerful mortars that the Russian military has, and of course these TOS 1A thermobaric multiple rocket launch systems. The Russians also have all kinds of other weapons that are used to clear minefields and to demolish fortifications. And of course, they will be producing large quantities of these. So this is the kind of unit that the Russians probably are preparing several brigades of. And the fact that they are doing that surely is further proof that some kind of offensive is being planned. Why create these assault brigades, these elite assault brigades, to smash, to break Ukrainian defenses, if you're not planning to go on the offensive? Specific units are now being created precisely for that purpose, and it's being openly talked about and reported on in the Russian media. So, further proof, further evidence that the Russians are preparing to take these steps. Before I leave these discussions about the military situation, I would like to discuss briefly a piece that was written by a Russian general, retired Russian general, General Gurulev, who apparently, not apparently, he did. He wrote a piece which lots of people in the West, in Ukraine, supporters of Ukraine, have seized on. It's a piece that appears to cast heavy doubt about Russian claims of Russian military advances and makes certain rather pointed claims about the way in which the Russians are conducting the war and about the ways that the Ukrainians are conducting the war that seem to be critical of the Russians and which some people see as evidence that, in fact, it is the Russians, that this is a Russian military officer. He's admitting, in effect, that the war for Russia is not going well. I noticed, for example, that Alexander Motyl, who is a strong supporter of Ukraine in the United States, he's been around for a long time, and he writes extensively for, in support of Ukraine. He is of Ukrainian extraction himself. Anyway, he's written a piece recently which draws heavily on General Gurylyev's piece. I have to say, I have been aware of General Gurulyev for some time. Suffice to say that he seems to me to be somebody who's very critical of the Putin government and of the leadership of the Russian Defense Ministry. He's been giving pessimistic commentary about the progress of the war for a very, very long time. And to be frank, I don't place a huge amount of weight in some of the things he says. He gives, to give one example, just one of many, but drawn from this specific article, he says that the Ukrainians have managed to advance so far, so close to the Russian fortified positions, that it is no longer possible for the Russians to deploy their Kharkov 52 Alligator helicopter gunships, because the Ukrainians have now been able to forward position surface-to-air missiles, and that means that the Kharkov 52s can no longer conduct operations in the way that they previously did. Well, it is the case that there are fewer Kharkov 52s operating over the battlefronts than was the case previously, though contrary to what General Gurulyev says, they do still operate over the battlefields. But the reason there are fewer of them is not actually especially difficult to understand. It is not because the Ukrainians have made advances. It is because the Ukrainians, some weeks ago, changed their tactics. They don't conduct big armoured offensives anymore. They don't deploy tanks and infantry fighting vehicles in large groups as they did at the start of June and in the end of July, as General Tarnavsky and other Ukrainian officers now regularly tell us. They engage instead in infantry assaults in small groups of infantry carrying out penny packet attacks, probing and trying to create defense weak spots in the Russian front lines. Now, given the relative absence of tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, there is less need for the Kharkov 52s, whose purpose is primarily to destroy tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, so it's not surprising that we are seeing fewer of them. It's not because, or so it seems to me, the air defense position, Ukraine's air defense position on the battlefronts has improved. Now, I would have thought this was fairly obvious also to General Gurulyev, but anyway, he's got his own objectives and agendas and perhaps his own perspective, but that doesn't mean that we have to agree with him. And that's what I wanted to say. I don't think that too much weight should be placed on what he says, And I'm afraid that all of those people, like Dr. Martel, who are basing their analyses on his writings, are barking up the wrong tree. So that's what I would say about that. We are now, as I said, probably at the end or tail end of the Ukrainian offensive. They might try one last big attack before autumn closes in. They're not realistically going to resume their attacks in the late autumn or winter. Their losses have been far too high for that to be practical. The initiative will go back to the Russians. Their build-up continues. Dmitry Medvedev says that now an additional, the number of volunteers who signed contracts for the Russian army has increased to 320,000. So the Russians are only 80,000 from their 400,000 objective for the whole year. So Russian build-up continues, Russian re-equipment continues, and now we see that the Russians are working to set up these assault brigades, which, as I said, clearly have an offensive purpose. Their purpose being to punch through the front lines, to break through fortifications and minefields and such things, to allow the armour and the infantry to surge through. As I said, what the Russian plans are, as I've said many times, they don't share them with me. But anyway, that's where we are in the war. Now, I have also spoken at length in the last few programs about how we've had a cascade of increasingly tough comments from Russian officials. There have been very tough comments from Sergei Lavrov, and there have been more comments from the Speaker of the Duma, Mr. Volodin, who says that Ukraine's options are really now down to two, that they've reduced to capitulation or Ukraine's ultimate destruction as a state. And we've had comments from the Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu, who says that the West is leading Ukraine on a path towards self-destruction, which essentially mirrors what Volodin said. Now, Lavrov has just given another very, very lengthy interview to the Russian news agency TASS. The Russian Foreign Ministry has not yet provided us with a complete translation, the complete text of this interview, and we have to piece together the relevant things that Lavrov has said about the war in Ukraine from extracts provided to us by TASS. Anyway, TASS says that Lavrov says that ultimately it is the West that is to blame for the fact that Ukraine is losing territory and is in the process of being destroyed, effectively demolished. And this is what, on that point, TASS quotes Lavrov as having said over the course of the interview. He says, when those who developed the Minsk agreements, together with President Putin, acknowledged that they had in fact misled him, as they had not planned to implement the Minsk agreement, they ruined the territorial integrity of Ukraine, which they now seem to be so concerned about. Former German Chancellor Angela Merkel, former French President François Hollande, and former Ukrainian President Pyotr Poroshenko all said last year that the only goal of the Minsk agreement was to buy time to replenish weapon stocks for the Ukrainian regime to fight against the Russian Federation. Had they implemented the Minsk agreements, they would have ensured Ukraine's territorial integrity, because this is what the accords were about. Territorial integrity was supposed to be restored after Donbass, the Lugansk and Donetsk People's Republics received special status. That's the first thing Lavrov says. So he says, worrying about Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, you yourselves, you in the West, you in Ukraine, ultimately destroyed it because you undermined, you sabotaged the Minsk agreements, which were the only way, the only route map towards achieving the restoration of Ukraine's territorial integrity, minus, of course, Crimea, and sovereignty. You sabotaged that process, and you've now, as a result, found yourselves in a war, which means that we can't, that situation can no longer continue. If you are really concerned about Ukraine's territorial integrity, think back on your own mistakes, and if you want to see who is responsible, well, basically look in the mirror. That's what Lavrov says. And then he says that in light of all of this, how can Russia trust the West? And how can it trust the West in relation to a potential ceasefire or a freezing of the conflict? And again, this is what TASS says that Lavrov had to say about this. When asked if there were any signs that talks on Ukraine could be launched in the autumn, Lavrov answered in the negative. By spreading such instigating rumours, the West seems to be testing our readiness to accept its terms. In fact, they make no secret of their terms, which include a few months' break and no agreements except for the one on a ceasefire. And they seek to buy time to flood Ukraine with more weapons in addition to what has already been provided and is now being steadily destroyed by our armed forces. And he again reiterated, they have actually admitted that no one was going to implement the Minsk agreements, nor Germany, nor France had such plans, and much less Ukraine. So in effect, how can we trust them? But note again what Lavrov says. When they talk about a freeze, what they're talking about is not an actual agreement to end the conflict. They're simply talking about a freeze. And as far as they're concerned, all that opens up is, in effect, the rearming of Ukraine. Why should we in Russia agree to that? Especially given that we're proving very successful in destroying the weapons the West is giving to Ukraine. They seek to buy time to flood Ukraine with more weapons in addition to what has already been provided and is now being steadily destroyed by the Russian armed forces. So there is no incentive for Russia to agree to a freeze. The Russians are not going to agree to a freeze. They're not going to agree to a ceasefire. Any idea that this can be brought to a stop on West German or South Korean lines is moonshine. The Russians will not agree to it. And Lavrov then goes on to say that the West is not making any serious proposals to end the war. As to how all this will end, we don't see any serious proposals from the West. And then Lavrov goes on to say, TASS goes on to say that Lavrov pointed out that African delegations had earlier visited Russia, calling for resolving the issue peacefully. Peace proposals had come from China, Brazil, and other countries, as well as from the Arab League. All of them, this is a quote from Lavrov now, were guided by a sincere desire to facilitate an agreement which would consider the root causes of the current situation and the need to eliminate them, and will also ensure equal security for all parties. In other words, Ukraine remaining outside NATO. And then he goes on to say the West is now talking about the possibility of talks, but at the same time, it is openly and categorically stating that Zelensky's peace formula is the sole basis for negotiations. There is no point in discussing it, as it is nothing but an ultimatum. No sane person would promote such an ultimatum as the sole basis for talks unless they seek to disrupt talks. Here's where things actually stand. And what Lavrov is saying is this. We get all this talk about a freeze of the conflict. We're hearing all about this all the time. What it all amounts to, at the end of the day, is a request for an indefinite ceasefire. An indefinite ceasefire that doesn't resolve any of the larger issues. It doesn't resolve the issue of Ukraine's NATO membership. It doesn't resolve the issue of the rights of Russian speakers in Ukraine. It doesn't consider the issue of Ukraine's one day perhaps trying to acquire nuclear weapons, which some Ukrainian officials, and by the way, even some of their supporters in the West, have talked about or hinted about. It doesn't resolve the issue of the widespread existence in Ukraine of the toxic ideology left over from the Second World War, which was spectacularly on display recently in the Canadian Parliament whilst President Zelensky was there. It doesn't address any of these issues. Instead, when the West is asked, what is your long-term plan for Ukraine? They continue to hide behind Zelensky's proposal, which is the only actual proposal, the only formal proposal on the table, which is, of course, for Russia to completely withdraw from every millimetre of territory claimed by Ukraine, including, of course, Crimea, for Russia to pay Ukraine reparations, for Russian leaders to agree to place themselves on trial, for, well, all kinds of things of that nature. And then only after all that has happened does President Zelensky say that Ukraine will sit down with Russia and talk, though not apparently about Ukraine's aspiration to join NATO or the EU, at which point, of course, that begs the question, what exactly are Russia and Ukraine supposed to talk about? So, Lavrov says this isn't a peace plan, it's an ultimatum, it is a set of maximalist demands which the Russians inevitably are going to reject. And he says that in light of this, talk of negotiations at this time is absolute nonsense. It's not something that the Russians are interested in because the West has not put together any kind of proposal. All they're talking about is a ceasefire, which is what a freeze of the conflict ultimately is about. And the Russians are not interested in a ceasefire. He said that a short time ago. He said, why should the Russians agree to a ceasefire which will just allow the West to rearm Ukraine and potentially integrate it into the Euro-Atlantic structures, into NATO and into the EU. The Russians are prepared to negotiate, but they are not prepared to countenance a ceasefire. Lavrov made that clear a couple of days ago, and he is in effect saying it again. And as to what Russian terms would be, well, they would cover all kinds of issues. But he also says that our position remains the same. We're ready to make agreements provided that the current situation on the ground is taken into account, as well as our position that everyone is well aware of, and our security interests, including the need to prevent the creation of a hostile, what he says, Nazi regime near Russian borders, which is openly declaring the goal to eliminate all things Russian in the areas of Crimea and Novorossiya. Notice use of the word Novorossiya, that Russian people have been exploring and developing for centuries. And Lavrov also said that the longer that the Ukrainians delay substantive talks with Moscow, the more difficult it would be to reach an agreement, which takes us back to what Volodin said, that either Ukraine must accept Russian terms or the war will go on until eventually the point is reached where Ukraine as a state no longer exists. And what Lavrov is talking about here is, when he talks about the situation on the ground, he means that Ukraine must actually recognize that the four regions, Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson, are now part of Russia. But they must also be prepared to sit down and talk about other things. They must talk about Russian security interests, which is to say, Ukraine won't be able to join NATO, probably by now won't be able to join the EU. Most unlikely, I would have thought, the Russians would agree to that any longer. And, of course, it must talk about what the Russians want to make sure that there is no hostile, far-right, neo-Nazi regime near Russian borders. That's what Lavrov says. That's what Lavrov is talking about, which it's difficult to see can mean anything less now than regime change in Kiev, a complete reconstitution of the Ukrainian government, excluding all of those people who in effect hold power in Kiev today and who have held power in Kiev ultimately ever since the Maidan events of 2014. So Lavrov talks in a much more measured way than Volodin does. He doesn't say things as bluntly and as harshly as Volodin does. He has to be more careful, more measured in his use of words because, of course, he's Russia's foreign minister. He has to go out and meet foreign leaders, and he has to explain Russia's position more carefully. But overall, when you take a step back and look at what he's saying and analyze it carefully, you see that it is essentially the same as what Volodin said. Volodin said Ukraine's choice is capitulate or cease to exist. Lavrov is saying the same. He says we're not interested in a ceasefire, we're not interested in a freeze, which is just ultimately a glorified ceasefire and nothing else. We see this simply as a device for the West to rearm Ukraine and perhaps ultimately integrate it into NATO and the Euro-Atlantic security structures. We want regime change in Kiev. We want Ukraine to recognize loss of the 4 regions. We want, in other words, Ukraine to capitulate completely to our terms. We don't trust Ukraine. They showed astonishing bad faith over the Minsk agreement. We don't trust the West. They showed astonishing bad faith over the Minsk agreement. They refused in the past to discuss our security concerns. We are now insisting on nothing less. And if the West continues just talking about a freeze, in other words, a glorified ceasefire, and continues talking about Zelensky's proposal as the only actual proposal they're prepared to officially commit to, then there is no reason why the war should not go on, and should not go on until Russia achieves victory, either fulfills all its objectives by forcing the Ukrainian state into capitulation, or alternatively brings about the final collapse of the Ukrainian state. Now, the historian Jeff Roberts has written another fine article, this time for Pearls and Irritations, again for Pearls and Irritations, and he says that this is Ukraine last chance for a negotiated peace, and he says the next few weeks could be Ukraine's last chance to grasp the flower of safety from the nettle of war by negotiating a compromise peace with Russia that would safeguard its future statehood and sovereignty. The strategic failure of Ukraine's summer counteroffensive signals it is locked into a losing war of attrition with Russia that can only add to the already immense suffering of its people, will likely result in further territorial losses, and may perhaps imperil the country's very survival as an independent state. And then he goes on to say that the counteroffensive's grandiose aim was to force a Russian strategic retreat from southern Ukraine. After 4 months of incessant infantry and armoured attacks, Ukraine's armed forces have achieved little except the liberation of a few villages located in the outer zones of Russia's belt of defences. The cost to Ukraine has been astronomical. Tens of thousands of casualties and hundreds of destroyed tanks and infantry and armoured vehicles. And then Roberts goes on to say, very correctly, and with some degree of bitterness, it was widely reported that Ukraine undertook this offensive at the behest of Western armchair generals who, like Hitler when he invaded Russia in 1941, thought all you had to do was kick in the door and the whole rotten structure would come tumbling down. The many new brigades raised by Ukraine and equipped by NATO have been butchered by Russia's formidable air force, artillery, missiles and minefields. I have to say I agree with every single word written there. This whole counteroffensive has been a disaster. It has indeed, as far as I can see, been largely conceived in the West, though it must be said that Ukrainian generals like General Zaluzhny made no serious attempt back in the autumn to push back against it, and President Zelensky himself went along with it, as did his defense minister and lots of others. But Ukraine was pushed into this offensive by people who might actually have military ranks and titles, may belong to Western militaries, but who have acted in all respects like Western armchair generals and I suspect that all kinds of civilians have been there among them. And Roberts goes on to say that for the Russians, Ukraine's NATO membership, the expansion of NATO into Central and Eastern Europe, has been a major issue, and at the very least, the Russians will want the control of the territories that they now occupy to remain under their control. And he also says that Putin would drive a hard bargain to acquiesce to any form of Ukrainian membership of NATO. There is no chance that he will agree to a ceasefire or a frozen conflict that will enable Ukraine to recover its military strength. Well, I don't think there is any conceivable way that Putin will agree to any form of Ukrainian membership of NATO. I think that has never been an option for Putin. In fact, he's made it very clear that as far as he's concerned, it's a red line. And this has been stated by Russian officials going all the way back to the mid-2000s. Lavrov, after all, warned William Burns, then at that time the US's ambassador to Moscow, that it was a red line all the way back, I think, in 2006. I don't think anything has changed there. And as Roberts absolutely correctly says, there is no chance Putin will agree to a ceasefire or a frozen conflict that would enable Ukraine to recover its military strength. And we have seen Lavrov say exactly the same thing. Now, I agree with Roberts again that these weeks, these few remaining weeks that are left before the Rasputitsa ends, are probably the last real opportunity for a serious negotiation that will result in the survival of Ukraine as an independent state. Roberts put it rather more moderately. He says that continuing the war will inflict more devastating losses on Ukraine. It's absolutely right. And more loss of territory by Ukraine, which is also absolutely right. But we see already that Russian officials are now talking about the end of Ukraine as a state, and Roberts concedes that this could be a potential outcome if the war continues, and is a serious danger to Ukraine if the war is prolonged. So I think the situation from Ukraine's point of view is even more urgent than Roberts says. I think the tone of Russian comments, the tone of Lavrov's interview to TASS, even an interview which Lavrov is trying, up to a certain point, to appear reasonable, make it absolutely clear that he thinks, well, that the Russians, in effect, are demanding from Ukraine a great deal. They want the 4 territories, obviously. They want regime change in Kiev, and they want the absolute categorical enshrinement of Ukraine's neutral status and a situation where Ukraine no longer receives military assistance from the West. Now, given that you are in a losing war, given that the very survival of your state is now in question, given the enormous losses that have been incurred, given the fact that prolonging the war is simply likely to incur even more losses, on any rational calculus, Ukraine's leaders and Western leaders ought to be heeding this advice, and they ought to be sitting down and engaging the Russians in what Lavrov calls meaningful negotiations, which is basically accepting the outcome that Lavrov and Volodin are talking about. But it's not going to happen. People in the West, positions in the West are too entrenched. And as I discussed yesterday, Budanov, General Budanov, who represents what is undoubtedly a strong current of opinion in Kiev, and who has the support of some extremely tough people there, they're committed to making sure that such a negotiation never takes place, not under any circumstances. And in my opinion, they would continue to resist that, even if the alternative were the end of Ukraine as an independent state. They would rather go down fighting than negotiate. I think Lavrov understands that. I think the Russians do. And we see with the formation of these assault brigades that the Russians are now seriously preparing for the offensive, for their offensive, or offensives, plural, and are now increasingly envisaging the end of Ukraine. So that's, I think, where we are. An unsuccessful offensive, an offensive which, frankly, as of this moment in time, looks like a strategic disaster, a catastrophic failure, but no willingness to learn any lessons from it, no ability to change course. Some people in the West talking about a ceasefire and a freeze. No willingness, however, to engage the Russians in substantive negotiations, and absolutely no willingness to do that on the part of Ukraine itself. Roberts may be right that this is the last chance to engage the Russians in that kind of negotiation. But it seems to me that the door for negotiations has all but closed, and the Russians themselves have come to the conclusion that such negotiations now are never going to happen, and that a military solution is the only way. Anyway, that's how I read Russian statements. Now, I'm going to now discuss this topic which I wanted to discuss several times, which is the deterioration in relations between India and the West. And I noticed that there are now increasing numbers of hit pieces against Prime Minister Modi specifically appearing in parts of the British media. There was an article to this effect in the Daily Telegraph. There's been apparently some articles in the United States. And M.K. Badrakumar has written an absolutely wonderful article on this very topic in Indian Punchline, in which he provides a lot more information I didn't know about the run-up to this affair with this Sikh activist who was assassinated in Vancouver, in Canada. And Badrakumar makes a number of very interesting points. He says that Trudeau, through a press conference he gave on the margins of the UN General Assembly, I'm now reading from Badrakumar. He says that he has dragged Modi into the eye of the storm by referring to his direct and frank conversation by Modi at the G20. He has asserted that Canada is standing up for the rules-based order, and he says that, and by analogical reasoning, the analogical reasoning that Trudeau introduced for the first time on finding a common relational system between India's alleged violation of Canada's sovereignty under international law and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And that's all very serious. And Badra Kumar also makes the further point, one which I didn't know, which is that it's now been confirmed by David Cohen, who is the US ambassador to Canada, that the Canadians have been sharing intelligence amongst Five Eyes partners, and that it was this that prompted Trudeau's, again I'm reading from Badra Kumar, offensive allegation last Monday about Indian agents' involvement in the killing of this activist. And Cohen added there was a lot of communication between Canada and the United States about this. We have been consulting throughout very closely with our Canadian colleagues, and not just consulting, coordinating with them on this issue. And from our perspective, it is critical that the Canadian investigation proceed, and it would be important that India work with the Canadians on this investigation. We want to see accountability, and it's important that the investigation run its course and lead to that result. And as Badra Kumar also points out, there have also been comments basically along the same lines from Jake Sullivan and from Tony Blinken. Sullivan said that we have concerns with India, whether it comes to issues relating to the very watch list that you've described, or otherwise we make those concerns clear, and we defend US interests as we do with every country in the world. Now, India is not Russia and China. It has its own, but it has its own, and China has its own set of challenges that we deal with in its own context. So, of course, there is going to be differences in how we deal with countries one by one. But the idea, the North Star of the Biden administration is, if you represent a threat to the American people's security, prosperity, or basic sense of fairness, we will take action to defend that. I think our record on that across multiple countries is quite clear. Regardless of the country, we will stand up and defend our basic principles, and we will also consult closely with allies like Canada as they pursue their law enforcement and diplomatic process. And as Badra Kumar also points out, Blinken has also confirmed that the United States is coordinating with Canada and has sought accountability. It's important that the investigation run its course and lead to that result. Now, let's take a step back and think what that all means. I mean, Badra Kumar spells it out, but I will join him. Essentially, it means that this whole affair with this Sikh activist who was assassinated in Vancouver, it bears it's covered, the whole investigation, the whole crisis is covered with the fingerprints of the United States and of the Five Eyes. They've been providing the information, intelligence information to Canada. They have been egging the Canadians along to bring this up with Prime Minister Modi. They're talking about accountability in India, and they're talking about the rules-based order being in India. And of course, Sullivan is now talking about how the United States will, wants this investigation to go on to its ultimate point. He wants India to cooperate fully with that investigation, even presumably if it leads to Prime Minister Modi himself. And he says that regardless of whichever country it is, the United States will stand up and defend its basic principles and that is the United States' record. Now, it seems to me that tells us that the United States not only has played a major role in orchestrating this affair, but that it is now openly threatening the Indian government and Prime Minister Modi specifically. I mean, it doesn't take much to decipher these words and to understand what they mean. Sullivan's comments, especially, for me, have a frankly godfatherish quality about them. You know, we expect you to cooperate fully, and, you know, this is all about a question of the rules-based order and about accountability. And, of course, what to me it looks like is saying to Modi, look, unless you play ball with us, we're going to come after you. That's essentially, at least to me, very much how it comes across. And Badr Kumar, it seems to me, makes absolutely valid points at the end. He says that Delhi's simplistic assumption at the end of his piece, assumption that the US regards India as counterweight to China, blah, 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 is a deeply flawed estimation of big power politics bordering on naivete, albeit encouraged by Western commentators. The naivety reached its apogee in a clumsy move to appease Washington by inviting Biden as the chief guest at the Republic Day celebrations in January and on holding a Quad summit in Delhi at the same time as the icing on the cake. We cannot be any more dumb-witted than that. This is Badr Kumar writing as a former Indian diplomat in India, as an Indian patriot. The Biden administration is nowadays courting China with a view to getting President Xi Jinping to visit the United States and agree a summit meeting with Biden, which the latter is keenly seeking with an eye on the November 2024 elections. And he then discusses how the United States is pulling out all the stops to try to initiate some kind of a dialogue with Beijing, even as they're pushing the Chinese to take the Indians to take a hard line against China and all that. And he's absolutely all right about this. And he then goes on to point out that all in all, the Nijar affair, that's the activist who was assassinated, takes the lid off the acute contradictions in India's foreign policies. The assumptions driving the foreign policy's China-centric thrust turn out to be delusional. The Westernist trajectory has landed in a cul-de-sac. The assiduously propagated, larger-than-life global image of India turns out to be a mirage. Foreign policy built on personality cult and opportunism, rather than rational and consistent principles, attuned to the world in transition, got battered, and most important, the hubris in India's diplomacy boomeranged. The Nijar affair poses an existential dilemma. Surrendering to the United States will make India look a surrogate state and a laughingstock in the global south. Indians won't approve of it. On the contrary, ignoring the diktat will be hugely consequential. Make no mistake, Five Eyes has a gory history against the Soviet Union. In the post-Cold War era, it all but destabilized Hong Kong, as today is an active player in Myanmar and Thailand. Its entry into the subcontinent is ominous. In a week's time already, what appeared to be an investigation in a murder case has got entangled into the rule-based order and the working of the international system and the BRICS. That is a dramatic escalation, signalling discontent, Western discontent with the government. In effect, what the US expects by accountability is nothing less than a dismantling of the national security state that India transformed into through the past 9 years. And we can see exactly what Badra is basically saying. It's a simple point. The United States is most unhappy with Modi. It's unhappy with the whole direction of Indian policy. It wants India to join the rules-based order, which of course means accept subordination to the United States. And if India doesn't do that, well, the Five Eyes, which have had this history against the Soviet Union and all but destabilized Hong Kong and are now doing their work in Myanmar and Thailand, in India's own neighborhood, well, all that will be unleashed on India as well. And in the meantime, Modi's own reputation will be battered as a result of the way in which this investigation in the United States, in Canada, is being conducted. That is the choice India faces. Now, I'm going to say I take a rather more sympathetic view as a non-Indian with the way in which India's foreign policy has been conducted. But my own feeling, my own sense, is that India is now once again confronting the modern reality. With the United States, it's always either you're with us or you're against us, and there is no middle way. And if they decide that they're against you, they will do everything they can. They will pull out every stop to make life as difficult for you as possible, even if they can't remove you, which is what they will try to do. And here I will say straight away that I've read some very fine pieces by John Helmer in particular about the diamond sanctions against Russia, but I've also had various private emails. And one of them pointed out something that I did not know, which is that the center of India's diamond industry is Surat, which is, of course, apparently Prime Minister Modi's hometown. And in fact, I subsequently learnt that the diamond trading center in Surat is the biggest office building in the world, biggest commercial building in the world. It's now actually bigger than the Pentagon. It's huge. So this is a huge industry for Surat, for Gujarat. And of course, this is striking, in other words, this attempt to complicate global trade in diamonds, an important trade affecting Surat, because of course Surat is a major importer of diamonds from Russia. It's again another strike at Prime Minister Modi himself, attacking him at in his own home base. All of this, whilst this affair with the Sikh activist, the assassination of the Sikh activist in Canada, is now being blown up. We can see the pressure that Modi himself is coming under. Now, what he decides to do, whether he buckles or whether he continues along this path, is of course a matter that only he can decide and members of his government. But I agree with Badra that if India surrenders to the West in the way that the United States clearly wants, then all that will do is lead to the collapse of India's influence, which has grown increasingly in the world, and will probably bury any hope for the time being of India successfully becoming a great power. we can see how angered the United States has been by Modi's conduct at the BRICS summit and subsequently at the G20 summit. The way they've pulled the plug on him in so many ways. But it is how the US behaves nowadays, and perhaps Prime Minister Modi should have known that. Well, this program has gone on for a very long time. I'm going to stop now. This is the end of today's program. More from me soon. Let me say again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals and Rumble. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. And of course, if in spite of its length you've liked the video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. More from me soon. Have a very good day, and I'll be back tomorrow.